In every war, there are stories we are allowed to know, and those deliberately buried under layers of secrecy, sealed inside locked cabinets marked Eyes Only. The Second World War, with its monumental battles and infamous atrocities, still hides untold truths in the shadows of official history. Within the dust of forgotten archives and the cryptic language of declassified files lies a different narrative. One where governments bartered in secrecy, alliances twisted in silence, and human lives were gambled away to protect hidden agendas. Some documents were deliberately destroyed, others misfiled under false identifiers, and many more remain redacted with thick black ink. What has surfaced in recent decades, however, paints a chilling portrait of a war not only fought on the front lines of Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, but also behind locked doors in back rooms of intelligence services, church corridors, and clandestine border crossings. The documents whisper of convoys that vanished without explanation, of covert operations where entire villages disappeared in the Balkans, of diplomatic channels hijacked by secret religious pacts, and of prisoner exchanges that should never have existed between sworn enemies. Each revelation reshapes our understanding of the global conflict, challenging what we believe to be fact and reminding us of the fragility of truth in times of war. What follows are not myths nor mere speculations, but reconstructions drawn from forbidden files, fragments of evidence once too dangerous for the world to see, now resurfacing to confront us with the hidden machinery of power that dictated life and death during the darkest years of the 20th century. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Convoy to Murmansk. The Arctic convoys of the Second World War were among the most perilous undertakings of the entire conflict, sailing through freezing seas under constant threat from German aircraft, U-boats, and surface raiders. Convoy PQ-17, which left Iceland on the 27th of June 1942, was destined to become synonymous with tragedy, officially remembered as one of the greatest disasters in the history of naval logistics. 35 merchant ships set out with escorts to deliver tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies vital for the Soviet defense against Hitler's invasion. Only 11 reached their destination. Yet buried inside a series of Admiralty records once classified ultra-black lies an altogether different account, suggesting that this convoy carried more than mere material, and that its destruction was neither unexpected nor entirely unintended. Conventional narrative insists that PQ-17 was dispersed after intelligence suggested the German battleship Tirpitz was moving to intercept. First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound ordered the convoy to scatter, leaving the merchantmen defenseless. What followed was a slaughter. German aircraft and submarines hunted the isolated ships one by one, torching them against the black Arctic waters. But in an overlooked memorandum coded ADM CL 4427, references appear to a directive known only as shadow cargo. Certain freighters, according to this note, were outfitted not with standard tanks or munitions, but with sealed containers guarded by special detachments of Royal Marines who carried orders never to permit capture. Their instructions, preserved in testimony decades later, were chillingly clear. If boarding was imminent, they were to scuttle the cargo, even at the cost of their own lives. The Soviet Union had been pressing Britain for not just supplies, but for technology, specifically advancements in radar, cryptographic machinery, and experimental chemical compounds. A decrypted NKVD cable dated 14 June 1942, recovered from Soviet archives in the early 1990s, records Stalin's envoys insisting that special materials be delivered through the Arctic route. The timing aligns with preparations for PQ-17. Among the codenamed consignments, references to Magnetron Type H and Crimson Salt appear. Magnetron H is believed to denote advanced radar components then at the forefront of Allied research, while Crimson Salt is suspected to be a chemical compound tested in chemical defense. Laboratories important down, these were not items of conventional aid. They were bargaining, ships in a fragile alliance, survivors. From PQ-17 spoke of peculiar orders before sailing. Chief Engineer William Hargreaves of the SS Silver Sword later testified in a post-war interview that 2 unfamiliar crates, each marked only with the letter X, were loaded under direct supervision of uniformed men who refused to identify themselves. They occupied sealed compartments and forbade even the ship's captain from inspecting the cargo. When Silver Sword was attacked and abandoned, Hargreaves claimed he saw one of these crates lashed to a depth charge, deliberately detonated by crewmen before evacuation. No official record of such cargo exists in the convoy's manifests. This pattern repeated on other ships. The freighter SS Hartlebury carried mysterious auxiliary stores not accounted for in naval tallies. A Soviet intelligence document released after the collapse of the USSR identified Hartlebury as a priority vessel, noting, "Our comrades await its delivery with urgency." Hartlebury was sunk by German bombers near Novaya Zemlya. But divers who later investigated the wreck in the 1970s claimed the ship's holds were strangely empty, suggesting either prior offloading or deliberate destruction of its contents. Why would Britain risk sending secret technology through the deadliest shipping route in the world? The answer may lie in the political desperation of mid-1942. The Soviet Union was bleeding at Stalingrad, its cities ravaged and its armies retreating. Stalin demanded a second front in the West, but Churchill, unable to launch such an offensive yet, needed to placate Moscow. Technology, provided in secrecy, was a bargaining chip to secure Soviet loyalty and prevent the possibility of Stalin cutting a separate peace with Hitler. The files suggest the convoy was designed as much to deliver promises as to deliver arms. The order to scatter PQ-17, once considered a blunder, now appears in a different light. Some historians speculate the Admiralty deliberately used the dispersal to mask the true objective, to ensure that if interception occurred, no single coordinated convoy could reveal the existence of shadow cargo. Fragmentation increased losses, but also minimized the chance that Germans would capture an entire ship intact with its classified contents. Indeed, in Bletchley Park, decrypts of German communications, not a single mention is made of the Allies' technological cargo. The Germans celebrated the destruction of tonnage, but remained ignorant of what had truly been at stake. After the war, families of lost sailors pressed for answers. Many complained that Admiralty records concerning PQ-17 remained sealed far longer than those of other convoys. When partial files were released in the 1970s, entire sections were blacked out. Requests for clarification on shadow cargo were denied, with the Ministry of Defense responding that no such designation is recognized. Yet cross-references with Soviet archives have since confirmed its existence. A report signed by Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, in October 1942 praises the comrades in London for their successful transfer of materials essential to our scientific defense. This statement came months after PQ-17 was lost, raising questions about whether some cargo actually made it through in secret, perhaps via submarines or other clandestine means. Even today, mysteries linger. Why did Stalin thank London for deliveries when almost every ship was destroyed? Did some vessels offload their shadow cargo to Soviet submarines or ports in northern Norway before the convoy's demise? Or were Allied submarines waiting in pre-arranged locations to retrieve sealed containers before ships were sunk? Survivors recall hearing coded signals on the wireless just before dispersal, bursts of Morse code that did not correspond to known Admiralty orders. Some now believe these signals instructed select crews on when and where to abandon or transfer their classified consignments. The tragedy of PQ-17 thus conceals a dual narrative. On the surface, it is remembered as a disastrous defeat at sea, a humiliation for the Royal Navy. Beneath that memory lies a darker truth, that hundreds of men may have been sacrificed, their ships sent into near-certain destruction, not solely for the sake of supplies, but to mask the secret transfer of technology that would later fuel Soviet radar systems and chemical research. The silence maintained for decades underscores how governments manipulate the record of war, burying uncomfortable truths beneath layers of heroism and tragedy. Today, divers continue to investigate the wrecks scattered across the Barents Sea. Occasionally, they surface with tales of strange containers welded shut, their markings erased by saltwater and time. One team in the 1990s claimed to find remnants of an alloy unfamiliar for the period, quickly confiscated by Russian authorities before Western analysts could examine it. These fragments may hold the final clues to the shadow cargo of PQ-17. Yet, until the last blacked-out lines of Admiralty files are revealed, the full truth will remain elusive, trapped beneath the ice and waves where so many lives were lost. What is undeniable is that the Arctic convoy disaster was more than a tragedy. It was a calculated gamble, where secrecy and politics weighed heavier than human life, and where the real cargo was knowledge, guarded more fiercely than any weapon. Chapter 2: Operation Iron Wolf in the Balkans. In the rugged mountains of Yugoslavia, where the peaks of Bosnia and Montenegro cut into the clouds, and the valleys hid entire armies of resistance fighters. A campaign unfolded in late 1943 that has been remembered only as another ruthless German anti-partisan sweep. But the Gestapo's own file, no. 17, stamped with the eagle and swastika, reveals something altogether more sinister. Operation Eisenwolf, or Iron Wolf, was not only a counterinsurgency, it was a purge designed to eradicate an espionage corridor that linked the Axis-occupied Balkans to Allied command centers in Cairo and London, a corridor that also concealed a German traitor passing secrets directly to Moscow. What remains in the surviving documents is a mosaic of brutality, betrayal, and secrecy, one that never reached the Nuremberg trials, never entered Allied history books, and only resurfaced when fragments of the file were declassified decades later. The official German narrative described the operation as retaliation for partisan attacks that had derailed rail lines and destroyed supply convoys. General Alexander Löhr of Army Group E authorized a joint action. Waffen-SS mountain troops, supported by Croatian Ustashi militias, were dispatched to the Dermata Plateau and Drina River valleys, areas notorious for harboring Marshal Tito's partisans. Yet buried within the file is a telegram dated 9th of October 1943 from the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, demanding that all transmitting stations operating under British protection must be eliminated. The language does not mention partisans, but specifically stations, a reference unmistakably tied to clandestine radio outposts funneling intelligence to the Allies. These outposts were run by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, whose officers parachuted into Yugoslavia carrying portable Type 3 Mark II transmitters. Their reports tracked German troop movements, airfield construction, and supply lines stretching from Greece to Austria. The British had built a network that grew increasingly effective, especially after Italian capitulation in September 1943 opened new supply routes. The Germans knew the SOE stations were hidden not just in villages, but in monasteries and mountain huts, their signals encrypted and bouncing from Belgrade to Bari to Cairo. Gestapo reports in File No. 17 describe intercepting messages in October that revealed precise German unit positions, forcing them to admit there was a mole within their own command structure. This discovery turned Iron Wolf into more than a counterinsurgency. It became a witch hunt. What followed was a campaign of eradication. Villages like Plievlia, Focha, and Kolasin were encircled by SS mountain troops in November. Civilians were rounded up and interrogated for the whereabouts of radio men. Survivors' accounts recorded decades later describe brutal scenes. Families accused of harboring wireless operators shot on sight, livestock slaughtered, houses torched until nothing remained but charred beams against snow. One testimony from a survivor named Yelena Vukovic recounted how men in black uniforms dragged her father into the square, demanding he reveal the English radio. He denied knowing anything. They executed him with 2 bullets to the head in front of the village. Later, she said, they discovered a small antenna hidden in the loft of a schoolhouse, confirming the Germans' suspicions. Yet even as villages burned, the deeper target remained concealed within the German command. Abwehragent Hans Redemacher, codenamed Lichtmann, had been secretly transmitting to Moscow since 1942. His betrayal was suspected after German troop movements in the Balkans were repeatedly anticipated by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. File No. 17 contains only fragments, but one memorandum dated 14th November refers cryptically to a wolf within the wolf, language historians now interpret as a coded acknowledgement of an internal traitor. Iron Wolf, therefore, was not just a campaign against Tito's fighters, but a cover for an internal purge aimed at flushing out a double agent whose transmissions blended seamlessly with those of the British network. The brutality of the campaign was staggering. German reports listed hundreds of bandits neutralized, a euphemism concealing mass executions, but missing from the official tallies were dozens of captured SOE officers. Records from British archives note the disappearance of at least 12 agents active in Yugoslavia between September and December 1943. Their names appear in mission rosters, but never in casualty reports. Their files stamped only MIA. In the Soviet archives, however, one finds a disturbing detail. NKVD reports from Belgrade reference the transfer of foreign officers captured by the Germans, later interrogated and executed. It appears the Gestapo used the chaos of Iron Wolf to rid themselves of not just resistance, but also Allied agents whose presence embarrassed Berlin diplomatically. Croatian Ustashi auxiliaries added another layer of horror. Tasked with rooting out collaborators, they conducted mass arrests, targeting Serbs, Jews, and Roma under the guise of anti-partisan warfare. File number 17 contains chilling after-action notes from Ustashi Captain Ante Radic boasting of villages cleansed and radio nests destroyed. Yet post-war Yugoslav trial transcripts indicate that many of these so-called radio nests were nothing more than households suspected of sympathizing with the resistance. The lines between espionage purge and ethnic cleansing blurred into a single wave of violence. The Allies, too, were aware of Iron Wolf. Intercepted German communications decrypted at Bletchley Park in December 1943 referred to Eisenwolf operations successful, enemy signals reduced. British intelligence officers noted a sudden silence from several SOE outposts. Yet in official wartime communiqué, London downplayed the losses, emphasizing Tito's growing strength instead. The reality that entire intelligence corridors had been severed was concealed from the public. To admit otherwise would have undermined Allied confidence in Balkan operations at a critical moment when Churchill sought to prioritize Yugoslavia as a resistant stronghold. When the war ended, Operation Iron Wolf vanished into obscurity. At Nuremberg, prosecutors had access to fragments of Gestapo file No. 17, but the espionage dimension was deliberately omitted from proceedings. Instead, atrocities were catalogued under the broader label of anti-partisan reprisals. The fact that Iron Wolf also represented an internal purge of a German double agent was buried, likely to protect intelligence sources still active in the post-war era. Rademacher, the suspected Abwehrmole, was never tried, never even mentioned. Some believe he defected to the Soviets before capture. Others, that he was quietly eliminated by the Gestapo during the campaign itself. His fate remains unknown, erased like the villages that once sheltered British transmitters. Today, the traces of Iron Wolf survive in contradictory testimonies and heavily redacted files. In the mountains of Montenegro, villagers still speak of the winter when whole communities vanished. In British archives, requests for full disclosure of SOE losses in Yugoslavia are met with the phrase, "records incomplete." And in Moscow, a classified appendix to NKVD reports remains sealed, its title referencing wolf corridors and traitors eliminated. The convergence of these threads paints a picture of a campaign far darker than the sanitized versions of partisan warfare, a campaign where espionage, counterintelligence, and brutality fused into a single operation designed to silence not only Yugoslav resistance, but also inconvenient truths inside the Reich itself. Operation Iron Wolf, therefore, stands as one of the most disturbing illustrations of how war blurs the boundaries between military action and secret intelligence. On the surface, it was presented as another anti-partisan sweep, part of the brutal chess game between Axis occupiers and resistance fighters. In reality, it was an executioner's sweep, designed to choke off Allied signals, exterminate local populations, and erase a German officer whose loyalty shifted to the Soviets. History remembers the battles of Yugoslavia, the marches of Tito's armies, and the liberation of Belgrade. But in the dark valleys of 1943, beneath the Gestapo's file No. 17, there lies another story, one of vanishing radio voices, villages erased from maps, and a wolf that devoured its own before disappearing into the shadows of history. Chapter 3. The Vatican's Secret Armistice Pact. In the summer of 1943, Italy was crumbling. Benito Mussolini had been dismissed by King Victor Emmanuel III on 25th of July, German divisions were pouring across the peninsula, and Allied landings on Sicily threatened to ignite a new front in Europe. The official record tells of chaos, the Italian state collapsing, the Badoglio government secretly negotiating with the Allies, and the Wehrmacht seizing control of Rome within weeks. Yet in the restricted shelves of the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, today known as the Apostolic Archive, lies correspondence suggesting a far darker and more secret negotiation. Documents coded Concordat Protocol C describe a Vatican-brokered armistice not with the Allies, but with Nazi Germany, designed to secure Catholic strongholds and buy the Holy See a position of leverage in a Europe descending into ruin. The papers, discovered by researchers in the late 1990s, consist of encrypted telegrams between Cardinal Luigi Maglione, the Vatican Secretary of State, and envoys stationed in Bern and Madrid. Their language is cautious but unmistakable, references to northern Italy to be spared the fate of Sicily, and safe passage for German divisions toward the Alpine redoubt. The proposition was simple, yet treacherous. If the Vatican could mediate a separate ceasefire between Rome and Berlin, German troops would be allowed to withdraw northward in exchange for promises that Catholic institutions, monasteries, and holy sites would be preserved. The implication was staggering. The Church would effectively buy peace with Hitler's forces, stalling partisan resistance and weakening the Allied foothold on the continent. To understand how such a pact could even be considered, one must return to the days following Mussolini's fall. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, knew that holding the peninsula outright would be costly. He sought assurances that retreat toward Austria and Bavaria would remain feasible. The Vatican, fearful of Rome becoming a battlefield, offered itself as mediator. In one memorandum dated 3rd August 1943, intercepted later by OSS Station Bern, a papal envoy wrote of dialogues with the German legation regarding preservation of ecclesiastical sovereignty in exchange for orderly withdrawal. The memorandum bore the mark C Protocol, linking it to the so-called Concordat file. The Allies too were aware. American intelligence officers in Switzerland reported unusual diplomatic traffic between Vatican couriers and German representatives. Swiss border police detained one courier near Lugano in late August, carrying sealed letters with papal seals. The contents were confiscated by Allied intelligence and vanished into Washington's archives, never made public. Declassified OSS memoranda confirm their existence, noting only that Vatican overtures to Berlin indicate possibility of independent settlement. This language, buried in a September 1943 cable, shows that Washington knew the Church was exploring paths that bypassed Anglo-American influence entirely. Meanwhile, partisan fighters in northern Italy were intensifying their attacks, anticipating Allied advances. Yet Vatican intermediaries reportedly instructed sympathetic priests to counsel restraint. Testimonies from partisan veterans decades later describe clergymen warning them not to escalate assaults on German convoys, claiming, "The Germans will soon leave peacefully." For resistance, fighters who lost comrades in brutal reprisals, these warnings seemed like betrayal. One former partisan recalled that a priest in Lombardy pleaded with his unit to await Rome's arrangement, a phrase that took on chilling resonance when villagers were massacred by retreating SS divisions weeks later. The ethical dilemma facing the Vatican was profound. On the one hand, Rome feared destruction. German troops had orders from Hitler himself to reduce the city to ruins should it fall to the Allies. On the other hand, any negotiation with Berlin risked legitimizing Nazi presence and undermining the Allied war effort. The files suggest that Pope Pius XV personally authorized the C Protocol talks, motivated by both fear of annihilation and a desire to preserve the Church's influence in post-war Europe. A draft letter, unsigned but written in the Pope's own diplomatic style, implored German commanders to respect the sanctity of Rome and the continuity of Christian heritage. Whether this letter was ever delivered remains unknown. German responses, preserved in fragments within Gestapo archives recovered in Munich, reveal that Berlin took the Vatican overtures seriously. A report addressed to Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop notes that the Holy See proposes to act as guarantor of order in territories between the Po River and the Alps. The report also warned that Anglo-American forces cannot be permitted influence in such settlements. In other words, Germany saw the Vatican as a potential shield against Allied encroachment, at least in the short term. The idea of Rome as a neutral enclave, spared destruction, appealed to both sides, but it required silence about the fate of Italy itself. The Pact, however, never materialized. On 8 September 1943, the Badoglio government publicly announced its armistice with the Allies. German forces immediately launched Operation Axa, seizing control of Rome and northern Italy with brutal efficiency. Yet curiously, Vatican City itself was left untouched. Kesselring's troops encircled, but did not invade the papal enclave. Some historians argue this restraint was due to Hitler's fear of alienating global Catholic opinion. Others, reading the C Protocol documents, suspect it was the result of informal assurances made through Vatican intermediaries in the preceding weeks. The Germans would not storm the Holy See, so long as the Church refrained from openly supporting partisan warfare. After the war, the Vatican maintained silence. Official histories emphasized the Pope's role in sheltering refugees and opposing Nazi ideology. The C protocol files were sealed in the secret archive, their existence denied, but fragments survived in Allied intelligence records, in Swiss police logs, and in stray German cables captured by the Soviets. The convergence of these sources reveals a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge publicly: that the Vatican, caught between annihilation and survival, contemplated an armistice that would have preserved Catholic institutions while abandoning the wider Italian resistance to German retribution. The moral weight of these revelations is heavy. Could the Church have justified negotiating with the architects of genocide to preserve its walls and relics? Was Rome's survival purchased with the blood of villages in the Apennines, where resistance fighters were hunted down by SS divisions unopposed? And what of the Allies, who knew of the overtures yet remained silent, preferring to let the Vatican's duplicity remain buried? The C Protocol papers, though fragmentary, force us to confront these questions. Today, scholars still argue over the extent of Vatican complicity. Some claim the C Protocol was merely a contingency plan, never intended for implementation. Others insist it represented a genuine betrayal, a secret pact negotiated in the shadow of collapsing fascism. What is certain is that the Holy See was not a passive bystander in 1943. It maneuvered, bargained, and sought survival amid the ruins of Mussolini's Italy, leaving behind a paper trail that challenges the sanitized memory of neutrality. In the silence of the Apostolic Archive, bound in leather folders marked C, the Vatican's hidden diplomacy of 1943 waits to be read fully, a forbidden armistice pact that, had it succeeded, might have redrawn the fate of Europe itself. Chapter 4: Stalin's Hidden Prisoner Exchange Network. The common narrative of the Second World War presents Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as irreconcilable enemies after June 1941, locked in a death struggle on the Eastern Front. Yet deep within Soviet archives, declassified after 1991, lies dossier Trude 1127, a chilling record of clandestine exchanges between the NKVD and the Gestapo, conducted even as their armies slaughtered each other across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The documents describe not isolated incidents, but an organized network of transfers involving high-value prisoners, scientists, defectors, and political dissidents, exchanged through neutral intermediaries in Finland, Turkey, and sometimes even via carefully staged frontline crossings. What emerges is a portrait of realpolitik at its darkest, where ideology bent before pragmatism and the lives of individuals were currency in a secret market of power. The first indications of this network appear in a German Sicherheitsdienst memorandum dated 21 December 1941, recovered from Berlin after the war. It references Project Morgenstern, under which certain Soviet prisoners of war were returned in exchange for individuals requested by Moscow. At first glance, the note seems anomalous, but cross-references in the Soviet dossier confirm it. In February 1942, NKVD officer Vsevolod Merkulov signed off on the transfer of 30 Red Army deserters captured in Ukraine. In exchange, the Germans handed over Dr. Otto Reiter, a nuclear physicist suspected of wavering loyalty, who was quietly moved across the Finnish border into Soviet custody. Reiter disappears from Western records thereafter, but Soviet research logs from 1943 show a sudden leap in reactor design studies, prompting speculation that his coerced expertise fueled Stalin's embryonic atomic program. The exchanges grew more sinister as the war escalated. In May 1942, documents describe a transfer near Kandalaksha on the Arctic front. A German courier column escorted 20 captured Soviet political exiles, many of them Trotskyists, across a frozen river into Soviet hands. In return, the NKVD delivered a group of Baltic nationalists and suspected Polish agents, men and women accused of anti-Soviet agitation, straight into Gestapo custody. Most disappeared into concentration camps like Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück, their names later surfacing only in fragmentary death lists. These exchanges were sanitized in paperwork as special prisoner returns, a bureaucratic phrase masking human lives bartered away in silence. The mechanics of the network relied heavily on neutral intermediaries. Finland, officially co-belligerent with Germany but maintaining channels to Moscow, became a key conduit. Finnish intelligence reports seized by the Allies in 1944 note unusual prisoner movements under NKVD supervision. coded as repatriations. Turkey, too, facilitated covert handovers through its porous diplomatic channels in Ankara. Turkish border logs from 1943 record the unexplained passage of small guarded convoys labeled diplomatic personnel, later revealed to be disguised prisoner exchanges. Even Sweden's neutrality was tested. Red Cross shipments occasionally concealed high-value detainees transferred under the guise of humanitarian missions. The British new Bletchley Park decrypts stamped "Most Secret" reveal that by late 1942, Allied codebreakers were intercepting German messages acknowledging these exchanges. One decrypted communication from Berlin to Helsinki referred to the satisfaction of Moscow's demands under Trude arrangement. Analysts scribbled notes in the margins, confirm NKVD Gestapo liaison, yet the intelligence was never made public. Churchill's war cabinet feared that exposure would destabilize the fragile alliance with Stalin. To reveal that Moscow was secretly dealing with Berlin, while demanding Allied sacrifices at El Alamein and Stalingrad, would have shattered trust at a decisive moment in the war. Thus, the truth was buried beneath secrecy, classified as too damaging for public morale. For families of missing soldiers, the consequences were devastating. Thousands of men vanished without explanation, presumed dead in battle. In reality, some were victims of these exchanges, quietly handed over to the Gestapo or the NKVD. A Polish officer captured by the Wehrmacht in 1942 was believed executed at Khartoum, yet a fragmentary Soviet file suggests he was delivered alive to Moscow under Trude 1127. His trail ends in the Lubyanka prison registers. Likewise, testimonies from post-war survivors of Dachau mention prisoners who arrived speaking Russian, only to be segregated and removed within days. These were not ordinary captives, but political exiles traded like contraband. One of the most disturbing entries in Trude 1127 concerns a group of Jewish scientists detained in Vienna. In late 1943, Gestapo reports listed them as assets to be considered for transfer. Days later, Soviet records confirm receipt of technical specialists at a facility outside Sverdlovsk. Whether these men went willingly, coerced by promises of survival, or were simply exchanged against their will is unknown. What is known is that none resurfaced after the war. Their names are absent from Holocaust survivor lists, absent from Soviet scientific rosters, vanished into the abyss of intelligence secrecy. The exchanges continued deep into 1943, even as the Red Army pushed westward. One chilling entry dated October 1943 describes a handover on the Turkish border. 2 NKVD officers escorting a German courier who delivered a captured Soviet deserter accused of espionage. In return, the Soviets provided Berlin with a package of political prisoners, Hungarian communists who had fled to Moscow during the 1930s. The irony was grotesque: committed communists, sacrificed by Stalin to secure the execution of a single deserter. Ideology mattered little compared to control. After the war, the existence of Trude 1127 was denied. At Nuremberg, prosecutors avoided presenting evidence that might implicate the Soviet Union in collusion with the Nazi regime after 1941. Western officials, aware of the prisoner exchange network through intercepted communications, also remained silent. The Cold War demanded clear narratives: Stalin as ally turned adversary, not as a partner in backroom deals with Hitler. Families of the vanished were told their loved ones fell in battle or perished anonymously in camps. Only after the Soviet collapse did fragments of the truth emerge, when Russian archivists briefly opened the NKVD files to researchers before resealing them under state secrecy laws. The implications are chilling. The very regimes that portrayed themselves as mortal enemies were capable of transactional pragmatism, trading human lives like currency. Scientists who could advance weapons programs, political dissidents who threatened control, defectors whose loyalty was doubted, all became bargaining chips in a shadow war conducted behind the front lines. These exchanges reveal not only the cruelty of totalitarian systems, but also the fragility of the wartime alliance narrative. Behind the propaganda of United Nations against fascism lay clandestine deals that mocked the ideals publicly proclaimed. Even today, evidence remains incomplete. The Russian Federation has never released the full Trude 1127 dossier. German archives contain only fragments, many deliberately destroyed by retreating Gestapo officers in 1945. Allied intelligence files, especially at GCHQ and the CIA, still contain sealed volumes referencing NKVD Gestapo traffic, withheld on grounds of national security. What has surfaced is enough to sketch the outline. A hidden prisoner exchange network conducted in secrecy that defies the black and white morality of wartime propaganda. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that even at the height of ideological warfare, the lives of individuals were commodities, traded between enemies who understood that power often mattered more than principle. The ghosts of those exchanged still haunt the archives. Their names are scratched into the margins of files, half erased by clerks who knew too much. Their fates remain hidden in sealed vaults beneath Moscow, Berlin, London, and Washington. Stalin's prisoner exchange network stands as one of the most forbidden secrets of the war. A machinery of betrayal that reminds us how the lives of the powerless can vanish between the gears of empires, reduced to numbers on a ledger and signatures on a redacted page. The stories revealed in these forbidden files do not resolve neatly, nor do they provide the comfort of closure. Instead, they open wounds long thought sealed, forcing us to confront the shadows behind the official record of the Second World War. Convoy PQ-17, remembered as a naval disaster, now appears as a calculated sacrifice to conceal the transfer of secret technology. Operation Iron Wolf, passed off as a partisan sweep, was in truth a merciless purge designed to sever Allied espionage lines and erase a traitor within the German ranks. The Vatican's Concordat Protocol C exposes a church maneuvering for survival, negotiating with the very regime it condemned in public. And Stalin's prisoner exchange network, buried under layers of Soviet silence, demonstrates how even mortal enemies could barter human lives when power demanded it. These revelations raise questions that echo into our present. How many other files remain hidden in locked vaults, their ink fading, but their truths too dangerous to release? How many lives vanished without record, sacrificed to protect fragile alliances and fragile reputations? The war we think we know, the war of battles, treaties, and speeches, was only half the story. The other half is written in code names, sealed crates, couriers intercepted at borders, and prisoners whose names were erased. Until every archive is opened, every blackout line lifted, the full reality of the Second World War will remain obscured, a history deliberately fractured. Perhaps it was always meant to be that way, not a record of truth, but a battlefield of memory, where power decides which ghosts are allowed to speak and which must remain silent forever.